our speaker, James Walden, who is on the committee. If y'all have not met him, which y'all have seen him if y'all came to the earlier meetings, he's going to talk to us today about a project going on in close to downtown Conway. Actually, you could say it is downtown Conway. And I think it does a great job of kind of speaking to livability and that connection between transportation and land use that we are really concerned about here at Metro Plan. And after that, we're going to discuss something that we've kind of been touching on in our meetings, and I think it can be a very cathartic exercise to discuss like barriers to what James will be talking about, the livability, the livable communities that we're trying to build, such as the one at Markham Street. So we'll get a discussion. Basically, we just want to identify those barriers. We're not going to identify solutions at this point. And we don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole on things that are out of our control. So those are kind of some basic ground rules. But I think we can, as an MPO in our plan, we can say, here are barriers to what we want to do. That way other people at other organizations and other sectors can maybe work with us to address those issues. But again, James Walden is going to be talking about his project and the multiple projects that are going on. I don't have a fun fact like I did about Dave Roberts, so I don't think James is allergic to rhinoceroses like Dave was, but he's a really interesting guy. So Lakeisha, if you want to let him screen share, we can get this started.
All right.
You should be able to do so now.
I used to have fun facts, but I don't remember them anymore. Let me see. Okay.
And if everybody can mute while James is presenting, that'd be great.
All right. Is it showing the
Yep.
PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't necessarily want to do a PowerPoint for the purpose of subjecting y'all to a PowerPoint. It's more to show the graphics, and I've got a video in here. What I want to visit on is the Markham Street neighborhood and sort of the city's approach with reinvestment there and trying to foster sort of a more livable neighborhood next to our downtown. As a preface, I've only worked with the city since the beginning of 2019. Almost all of this work, including with Daniel and Lakeisha, is belongs to other folks. But hopefully, feel free to, Daniel, Lakeisha, jump in if I misspeak on any aspect of it with this. So the Markham Street neighborhood, you can see it's there. Highlighted in that kind of orangish line, which is just north of downtown Conway. If you look over to the right, the larger street that's over there is Harkrider. Markham Street, along with the Pine Street area, is really Conway's largest historically Black neighborhood, or only really historically Black neighborhood. It's a key corridor. Hendricks is up to the north, and downtown is to the south. Much like with some other projects that have gone on in other university towns in the state, really looked at ways to link the college campus to downtown. We've got some linkages with Front Street. The neighborhood is, I would say, is in a lot of ways characterized by demolition and neglect. A lot of the historic fabric of that area is gone, has been torn down, which it consisted of some, had a mix of single family residential along with some businesses. That the Markham Street corridor actually historically was the street leading out of town, out of Conway to the north, before they built Harkrider at some time in the past. And you can see in this picture is, so one of those structures, that this was the Deluxe Diner, which was listed in the Green Book. I think it may have first gotten listed in the Green Book in 1960s, which the Green Book was a tourist guide for African Americans basically for places that were safe to stop and visit. And so this is sort of the deluxe center. So there's a rich history within this area. But a lot of the existing structures are gone. You can see the context of where this is, where it sits in terms of next to the street. And for a long time, this area has been identified as a place, for study. I think probably at least 15 years. I think in some of the unofficial downtown studies and things that have been looked at, I think even Craft and Toll did a little bit of work at one point looking at this area a long time ago. And so it's been identified as being sort of a place that would be good for infill development and moving forward, looking at that. You fast forward to 2012, MetroPlan got the Jumpstart grant from HUD, which I guess was probably about a $1.4 million grant that looked at multiple areas within Central Arkansas, Levy, looked at JFK, 12th Street, Mayflower, Heart of Bryant, and also the Markham Street neighborhood in Conway. And this is really, in a lot of ways, a catalytic program that looked at, ways of encouraging livability. And it's was unique in terms of planning in that it planned for the area. It developed a code to carry out that plan, which is oftentimes is one of the things that doesn't happen. And then it also paired with it catalytic infrastructure to go as well. So it's really very unique. And honestly, even though it's been 8 years since that started, we're still just plowing the ground, and planting the seeds for what we are potentially going to reap with this over time. And so it's still, even though it takes a long time, and one thing I want to emphasize is that this type of work does take a very long time to see happen. Walter could probably share about with the things that happen with the River Market area and the transformation that you see in that neighborhood, that some of that stuff started back in the 80s in discussion about that. And so you see here an image. This is kind of it called for in the plan, it called for a mixed use neighborhood, the advent of some new and different housing products that we don't necessarily have in Conway with townhouses, or we don't have a lot of them. It called for a lot of multi-story mixed use commercial, and identified a couple catalytic projects. The first being sort of a redo of Markham Street. It's currently about an 80-foot right of way. It's a overly wide street and called for providing some infrastructure funding to redo that. And then a second one was sort of this Markham Square area that you see there where an amphitheater is defined. And so this was one of the photomorphs from that originally. Again, you can see it's 2-lane street, very wide. It was originally a concrete street. Again, was a state highway at one time. Photomorph indicated for, to have on-street parking, bike lanes, and what you can see a lot of development, either, 2-3 stories with commercial mixed use and things like that. So we always love photomorphs, right? And then you go back and look at it, back and look at it. And so that was one of the catalytic projects that obviously, we're looking at right now. Another was what I mentioned, the Markham Square, and this is Markham Square. So as you can see, when we talk about being an area of neglect, this was a scrapyard. And so we had to do a lot of environmental remediation. This started long before I came onto the city. This obviously had to have cleanup. We had to dig out in spots and got grants to handle that as well from Arkansas Natural Resources. And so this is what was planned. As you can see, sort of an amphitheater in there. But again, one of the challenges in Conway is that we don't have a really great public square. an area that's sort of a central focus. We've got a lot of corridors, but we don't have a central gathering space. And so this was kind of in part intended to fill that role. And then, so we had this idea of catalytic projects, and in that plan as well, they included pro formas for development. And that's one thing that's really key, is that in any type of development like this, we can plan for it, we can say we want it, but if the market isn't there and it doesn't make financial sense, private investment's not going to follow. But additionally, we have to, if we want to have certain forms of development or certain forms of livable development in there, then we've got to make sure that the regulations that we have are resulting in that type of development. And I don't just mean being permissive of that. That may mean in some instances requiring that. And because, when we look at the market, there is a hell of a lot of demand for single family and a lot of momentum in pushing and doing exactly what we've always done in terms of suburban style development, single family, strip malls, etc. So this is sort of an image of that. The red areas that you see, those are areas that we call for commercial mixed use. The orange areas are more of a mixed use with residential, and then the pinkish areas are what you would maybe term some extension of the Hendricks campus towards the south, towards downtown. And then that little green square, that's obviously Markham Square. So this is the original concept of what we looked at. I showed in that photomorph. And I think what's important when you look at any type project like this, that you start at conception and then you move forward, and what becomes reality is oftentimes very different. And so here's a video of, hopefully it will play. There it goes. It may be a little stilted, I apologize. But what you can see here is this is the sort of the south end of that. In terms of looking at the area, obviously it's currently under construction. We've got a nice large sidewalk on the left side. We've got components of sort of those pendant style lights that go through there. If you notice the wavy areas that come in and out, one of the things that we've included in there is a cycle track. And you see that on the top, the cycle track. That's intended to divert bicycle traffic in sort of a protected set of lanes opposite on one another there. And then you have the wide sidewalks. The intent is for the development to come up and meet and sort of meet that sidewalk eventually on both sides. Oh no. And we've got spaces for on-street parking as well as you go through there. This is another image of the cycle track and sidewalk that have sort of a split there. You'll notice these areas that are kind of dug out towards the left there, where we've got inlets coming from the street. Those are intended to kind of be rain garden type infrastructure that allow for groundwater recharge instead of putting it all off into the stormwater system. And then the rest of this video really goes into showing laying asphalt. If there's one thing we love in Conway, it is the smell of fresh asphalt. We love paving roads. People hate the condition of our current roads, and so anytime we're paving, people are happy. So this may be the highest number of road construction workers I've ever seen working at one time. But anyway, a little joke there. Oh, okay. How do I get, oh, I gotta hit escape and then forward. So again, that kind of is a look in terms of how that project moved from this concept and how it takes so long, and then we get to having it funded and what it looks like in reality. And we'll soon also be starting working on the second phase of that, going towards going towards the north to Hendricks. This is the Markham Square area in there that you see. That was the concept. This is the design that we currently have. It obviously looks quite a bit different. Again, you know, when you go from concept, you start with the idea and build something out. Previously, there's a lot of talk about an amphitheater in that location. We do have an amphitheater that's kind of in the northwest portion that you see there in that top right photo. And then, but in a large green as well. And what's important when you talk about creating an area that's unique and different and has an identity and is more livable, is the reason I focus so much is these catalytic type projects are a key way of how we spend our public investment sends a very strong message to private investors how they should be spending their investment. I mean, when we just come up with a plan and we say, this is what we want to do, and this is a concept, go after it. But when we actually commit funding and say, this is, people actually catch that vision, catch the reality of it. Had a similar thing happen in Russellville, where we had a downtown plan and the city decided, you know what, we're going to go in and build some bump outs on one of the main streets, and private investors said, okay, well, the city's really taking this seriously, and this vision that we have for downtown is something that we really should do. And so you know, we've had in Russellville, they had a ton of investment, private investment that's followed, where it was 5 years ago, the biggest problem we said was parking, but it really was honestly that there's too much parking, and now there actually is a real parking problem in some of those areas. So, and again, another concept that we talked about with this park is, well, once we develop a public square there, we've got to think about how do we extend. We've got this, if we're developing a neighborhood where we've got a lot of dense mixed use, and the idea is that the public realm is where you get that greenery, and it's not necessarily in a backyard. How do we extend this concept of livability, you know, into some of the edges of that park, and how we translate with our transportation infrastructure? And so we had also worked with UACDC in terms of developing some housing concepts for the surrounding area that tie into this plan. And one of the things that we keyed on was that we wanted to leverage the benefits of this park as much as possible and bleed over. And so we came up with some shared street concepts in terms of making that public realm extend to where it really is, in a lot of ways, if you're a pedestrian encountering the environment there in the park, that coming out into the street, it's almost as natural of an environment where you're just happen to be coexisting with cars and that as well. And so you can see that up there on the top left, where we've got parking areas and the shared street where traffic goes one way and the other, but it all kind of bleeds out naturally. And that's another concept that is real key. This is what it looks like in one of the renderings, where the cars are there, but they're passing through, and obviously they have a role in traffic, but there's as much emphasis given to how pedestrians interact in that area as it is to that as well. And like I said, this has taken a really, really, really long time. Any type of project like this, there's a lot of inertia, but we are starting to see some of the fruits of this. That this apartment complex, it's called a podium building, where the parking is underneath. But that podium on the ground floor could eventually transition into some type of mixed use as well, where if the sort of the owner wanted in the future to convert that to some type of lease space when the market bears that out. And so we've had some investments in these multi-story, living in downtown, which is not something that is anything that we've had a precedent for in Conway in the past. We've got that. And then additionally, another area, we've gotten sort of a new multi-story, two-story tenant finish out building that is a part of this, that's a product of this area that's on Front Street as well. that's currently being constructed. So, and that's I guess Daniel, I'll turn it over to you. That's really all I have.
That's definitely an interesting project. Obviously, my hometown is Conway. I live in Little Rock now, but I'm always interested to see Conway develop these concepts. Before we get into the discussion about barriers to this, does anybody have any questions for James? I know this is an interesting project, so if anybody had anything, make sure you're unmuted. Anybody?
I was just going to ask, coming from the historic preservation side of the house, it looked like, James, in some of the images, you were able to retain some of the buildings. I don't know if they're historically significant other than the one you pointed out that was in the Green Book, but is there an opportunity for those folks who have property that have viable, properties that could be rehabbed or modified or what have you?
I think to a certain extent, the Deluxe Diner is probably the one of the keys. That is an area, I think, going over time that we may need to make some modifications to the code that is in there. One of the challenges that you get within developing in a historic fabric is a lot of times when you're the code tool that you often use for livable environments is a form-based code, and the type of review that you need for historic preservation is really context sensitive. And so there's got to be some give and take and some blending between those two, particularly if it is a structure that has particularly important historic significance. The remainder of the area, a lot of it's just old, dilapidated single family.
So not very significant. The other thing I was wondering about is when you were talking about that podium building, so they have parking right there on the first level, but is it because of the way you've is it a PRD or PUD, and then they won't have to worry about it if they change that parking level to commercial or what have you, or is that already built in so it could easily be modified, or do you have to go through a whole new review process to make that modification? I'm just curious about that.
I think that one may be just outside of the zone area, but within our downtown, we don't have parking requirements. And I think that's one thing that's key is that, within your code, if you're wanting to create walkable, dense environments, maybe you don't have parking requirements.
Well, and traditionally in many places, if you're in a historic overlay, they don't have parking. I mean, they don't have parking requirements or they're waived if there's a historic overlay.
Yeah.
I've seen that in many historic areas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else have any comments or questions for James?
This is Chris Hancock. I don't have a question. I'll just say it was a really informative presentation. Thanks, James.
Oh, yeah. You're welcome.
I've got just a real simple question. This podium building, of course, it's apartments. Has Conway implemented any sort of density code as to how many apartments can be in let's say an acre or given area? What comes to mind is what's being built out on the old airport runway. There's hundreds of apartments in that complex, and I don't know that you would want that in the downtown area.
So obviously that is different, but we do have within the city's traditional zoning or the conventional zoning that we have. We do have certain density standards that apply with developments like that is out by the airport. Within this area, those density standards are relaxed quite a bit. And one of the things that when you look at the concept of housing within a downtown environment is you look at any large city that's teeming with life, that has a lot of commercial activity. What's fueling that in part is downtown living, people that live there. I mean, one of the reasons, in downtown Little Rock that you're starting to see, some of the small types of businesses go back in that left is because there's people that start to live downtown again. And so that means that, yeah, probably you have 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on the context of where it's at, that you are promoting downtown living. That's how you have, active areas where people are actually on the street. But do we want a massive apartment complex plop down in the same style that you have in the traditional garden apartment? No, because that just kills it would just kill it. You want it built around that block environment. Portland, no, I'm sorry, Vancouver. Vancouver's a great example of a city that has taken livability to kind of the next level, in that they have these really, really tall structures, but when you walk down the street in Vancouver, they call it Vancouver. Part of it, their planning is Vancouverism, is that it seems like it's just a nice mixed use environment, and that's because they try to create stuff at that human scale where they've got the mix of uses, where it's not just bam office, bam, whatever, that you've got a mix of uses there, and it creates an incredibly active street environment.
James, does the city have anything in place right now where, as the new development is coming in, it's not pushing out the residents that's already there or have historically been there?
Honestly, yeah, that equity concern is big. Part of it is it's already gotten to a level that, from a large extent, most of the folks that live there don't live there anymore. So there's not a lot of residential left, but that certainly is, I think anytime that you look at how you redevelop an area, you've got to look at treating people that live there, that are the original residents in that location, fairly and equitably, and making sure that you're not doing something that creates big equity issues.
Okay, well, I guess your phone's going off, so if you need to answer it. So I guess that's a good wrap up on that. Now, before we get into this discussion about barriers to what James just talked about, let's, can I screen share here? Did I just press that button? I'm gonna assume you said yes. Okay, so I'll just press that. Okay, so does everybody see this list of themes? Just like do a thumbs up or something. Okay, we got a thumbs up. So essentially, this entire time we've been talking about themes, and I've had a few of y'all, say, give me some feedback. I've kind of collated all of that information into 5 themes. Obviously, y'all saw that spreadsheet that I've put up a couple of times. I kind of reorganize it in a different way. I tend to organize things like constantly to try to get them down to a more digestible piece. So right now, what we've come up with in this group, I think these 5 major things we're talking about: accessibilities in transportation, obviously neighborhood design and placemaking, a little bit of diversity and community, economic opportunity, and then also the natural environment. So I think that's kind of what we've done so far. And of course, underneath every one of these, with transportation, obviously safety, connectivity, multimodal, walkability, those things. Obviously, when we're talking about neighborhood design, like we've talked about today, those mixed-use neighborhoods where you have accessible housing, pedestrian scale places. And then some of the other ones we don't have to get into as much right now, but these are the themes that we have kind of identified. And if you guys see anything that we need to think more about, let me know. But right now, let's work off of these themes. So I want to get y'all's opinions on if these are some of the things that we want to see in a community. What are those things that are preventing us from realizing this across the region? So I'm not going to call on people yet until it gets silent for too long, but just think about that for a couple of minutes. And if y'all can think of anything from a government standpoint, from an investment standpoint, other things that I don't think about, those government and politics standpoint are oftentimes what we have to deal with in planning. So those are the first things. What are those barriers? Anybody want to start?
Can I ask a question of James, sorry. When did Conway move to form-based code, and was it a challenging transition, or can you?
I mean, those are, we only have a few areas where that's actually applied.
Okay.
And to be honest, I mean, a lot of the developers are waiting for the park, they're waiting for the street before they rush in and develop. And so we've had some, a couple developments that have been reviewed. It's not been that awfully different, in part because we've got what I would term a conservation district for downtown, and we've got historic review. So a lot of the things that we look at are architectural, and those have been the issues that we've dealt with. So it's not been a huge challenge yet. It may.
Well, I was just wondering, I'm just curious about that, about rigidity of the code. Sometimes I would see as a barrier if there's just this strict adherence and challenge to go think outside the box or propose something outside the box, I guess. I don't know.
Well, and okay, this is a good, I think, barrier. From what I've seen is these form-based codes are very new to a lot of developers around here. They might not feel very comfortable with them. When it comes to a form-based code, as far as being too rigid, I would argue that a form-based code, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too much in this discussion, but a form-based code allows you to develop your property with more varied uses, as well as normally you can develop a lot that is maybe a weird shaped lot, a weird size lot.
Well, that's kind of my point, Daniel, is that I think that sometimes there's not an opportunity to be a little more flexible. You know what I mean? I think sometimes we're too rigid in our existing code that is not
exactly.
So yeah.
So those form-based codes are very, I think, helpful in developing a form, obviously, of the environment that we would like to see. So I would think that maybe a barrier to that would be education, developers not understanding the codes. So that would be an example of a barrier.
Gotcha.
Daniel, I'm probably the only person here that doesn't know what form-based codes are. James or Daniel, one, can you give me a brief understanding of what form-based codes mean?
James, you're good at explaining things.
Okay. Well, I wanted one quick follow-up on that. One of the things that we've gotten in response from developers or landholders hasn't been a lot of negativity towards it. In fact, they're excited about the potential because they see that the realm of possibility is expanded for what they can do with their property. I mean, you go from, well, I can build a single family house here to, you mean we could potentially have, commercial and residential above. It's like, okay, I'm not,
I think I see it as a positive. It's just, does the municipality have the capacity to go in that direction, the sophistication to go in that direction, to look at these developments?
Yeah,
that way.
and so form-based codes. Form-based codes, when you look at traditionally the ways of regulating land use, there's been kind of two key ways. There's one that's called Euclidean zoning. Euclidean zoning is essentially this way of, we're going to focus purely on the use, and we're going to really try to separate uses. So we're going to separate commercial, we're going to separate residential, we're going to separate industrial, and then we're going to set yard requirements. And Euclidean zoning or conventional zoning, what you see is a lot of that is a result of market pressures that happen. It kind of multiple forces that came together in doing that. It's really in a lot of ways a product in a lot of cities of the 1960s, but a lot of it's about separating uses. Form-based code, I mean, I've got some of my, I'll reserve some of my judgments about gimmick and terminology and things like that, but form-based code is more about what the structure looks like and how it functions on the property, and not as much about use. You can still regulate use with it, what goes on, but it's more prescriptive in terms of, these are the architectural standards, that the structure needs to be this. It's more about the performance of the structure and how it relates in that environment than necessarily what the use is going on in the property. One way to think about this is, if you build a multi-tenant building, do I necessarily care whether or not in that multi-tenant building it's an ice cream parlor or a barber? And in some, conventional zoning codes, an ice cream parlor would be allowed and a barber wouldn't. With a form-based code, it's really saying, yeah, this is a commercial building and do what you want inside, but we want to make sure it looks a certain way.
Okay, thanks.
And actually, David, the Heart of Mayflower, that is a form-based code. A lot of the challenges in certain cities is, honestly, they don't have the infrastructure to build based on the form-based code. So it helps to have an existing street grid system that you can basically say, we want to have our building face the street, the primary street, within 5 feet. So whenever you don't have the existing infrastructure and you're a small town, it might be a little bit more difficult. And so that's what we've run into in smaller cities. Unlike Conway, which has its infrastructure already there, some smaller cities they're like, well, we don't really have that foundation to build it off of. So you can run into some problems with that. But form-based code does allow for a lot of flexibility. Usually you can develop more of your lot. You can be more dense in a form-based code, but you can also make it to where you don't have to be that dense. But I think it does provide that flexibility. So anyways, we've gotten a little bit further away from the barriers. So we've talked about kind of the land use. Are there any thoughts on maybe barriers to quality multimodal transportation? So in other words, is there barriers to, what are the barriers to walkability that we see? What are the barriers to transit?
I'll be honest with you. I was a little bit nervous with that one slide that you showed us, James, with the where you have the sidewalk and the road kind of going together and people crossing. And I know that idea was they would naturally sort themselves out, but it made me a little bit nervous. But as far as barriers to walkability, certainly would be if we're looking at an existing neighborhood, sidewalks, lighting, those kinds of things. If they're not there.
Anybody else?
I would say from what I've heard, that the main barrier to our multimodal transportation system, or at least our public transit system in Little Rock or Pulaski County, is funding. Just there's a lack of funding, which leads to a lack of routes. And that's really the basis of it.
And that could also be the basis for reason, why we don't have decent sidewalks. The funding isn't there to replace, sidewalks, and in some developments, there's not a requirement to put in sidewalks. I think that's changing, but yeah.
Certainly, in going back to land use, when you have land use that is separated and very sprawl, I'm not usually allowed to use that word, but that does make it very hard to walk. So if you have a single family neighborhood that the lots are an acre wide and it's only single family, you might get some recreational walking in there if you have a sidewalk, but there's nothing to walk to. So mixing that land use is a way, and I said I wasn't going to get into solutions, but that is one way to address that barrier. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that? Walter, I know you have some thoughts.
Well, I'll continue what you just said. That only works if you do use and transportation together. We had a developer that asked to put some commercial right next to residential, though. So you think neighborhood commercial, you can walk to it. Wrong. You're going to have to go a half mile, even though it's a stone's throw from these houses, to get to it either on foot, bicycle, or car. You're going to have to go a half mile or a mile to get to it, because there's no road that goes that 600 feet or 300 feet to get there. And this developer is building all the residential as little fortresses. They're not gated, but they're still little fortresses, because there's one way in, one way out. And so the land use plan and transportation plan allow that to happen, but they would also allow it to be connected. It's been the choice of the private sector to fortify everything, so not the public sector. So your rules are usually permissive, and so if you want to get the connectivity, it can't always be permissive. You're going to have to require connectivity, or you're not going to get it, because everybody seems to want to, or everybody's bought into the argument that everybody wants to live on a house at the end of the cul-de-sac.
That's certainly, I've heard that argument be made by developers. This is the market and this is what people want. Well, that's the only thing being provided, then sure, it's the market. So you can say that everybody wants it that way. Let's see. So we've covered kind of transportation and land use. Some of these other things that we talked about. What's a barrier? And this is a little outside of what we do, but I think it's important, because anytime you're doing public work, you need to make sure that the public is participating in the things that we're doing for them. What would you say are some barriers to public participation in the process of our land use decisions and our transportation decisions?
Daniel, I would say on that, probably cooperation among the communities and the communication.
And I would just add, remaining cognizant of, working in historically underserved neighborhoods. It looks like Conway and their plan have been very intentional about it, but I could see where that could provide a lot of pushback. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the front end there.
I think the word education needs to be included in this, because I know that probably being representing the smallest community in this group of people, you have a lot of people that are opposed to change. The word change just scares people to death sometimes. They're afraid they're going to lose their identity. They're afraid they're going to lose their family traditions and so on and so forth. So I think you have to decide a way to communicate and educate the population, and then include them in some of those discussions and decisions, which is not always the case. Sometimes you have, let's just say, those that are in charge of economic development or land use, they tend to want to keep that somewhat close to the vest so that they can direct it or steer it the way they think it needs to go. And so consequently from that, you isolate some of these folks in your community, and then the fear comes up about the change and exactly what is it that you're doing to us.
Right, I agree with that. Certainly the educational component, getting people to engage first, and then making sure that they understand what's going on and how this affects them, and hopefully how this helps them. And then honestly listening to people is certainly something that we need to do.
What was that last word you said?
When I say words, I don't even remember them.
Listening, listening is what you said.
Listening, yes. Listening is definitely key. So I think public participation is always a work in progress, and certainly these days we have a lot of tools to reach people. It's just, how do we reach them? How do we get them engaged? And I think that's also part of the issue.
And I mean, honestly, these days, communication is hard too. I mean, just because of COVID, we can't be together in public meetings, and even participating in public hearings is a challenge, and is a challenge right now. And I don't know when we're going to come out of that, but not everybody can Zoom.
Right, that's true.
I'm thinking about my mom. She's 80 years old, and it's a miracle she knows how to get onto the Democrat Gazette iPad they gave her. And I don't know. I don't mean to underestimate her, but honestly, I think it would be a challenge.
Yeah. Well, that certainly is. And obviously, when you have all this discussion of, I'm about to go down a rabbit hole, but when you have all this discussion about access to education, certainly infrastructure plays a part in that, but having access to the internet is not as ubiquitous as people think. So before we go down a rabbit hole there,
can I say one
Sure.
other thing? I think one of the issues is also finding a way to keep the community engaged.
Yeah.
Central Arkansas was extremely engaged, not just Little Rock. I think Central Arkansas was extremely engaged in the 1990s. And that slowly started to, for various reasons, people thought, well, we've done it, it'll take care of itself. And some of it did, but a lot of it didn't. And so things that were done in the 90s are often still pointed to as the gold standards, but nobody's trying to redo that or successfully redo it that I'm aware of anyway. And the other thing is the staying engaged, and that's a huge issue because most people are crisis managers, not long-term developers. And if you're not a long-term developer, you're going to lose a lot of battles.
Right. And actually, just to piggyback off of that, I think certainly something that my industry has a problem with is moving projects slower than people expect. I know, in the 12th Street area, doing the Jumpstart project, there was planning fatigue, and they didn't see any movement, and it took probably 5, maybe even more than 5 years to finally get something done in that area. So I think constant communication is one thing you definitely need to do, but also a barrier is how do we prevent this slow backlog of projects from happening? How can we make those faster? And that might be streamlining it with other organizations that we have to work with. So moving on a little bit from the public participation, something that I've listed in at least 3 of these livability themes underneath the major headings, safety. So when we're talking about safety, there's obviously, we're talking about sense of well-being. When it comes to transportation, you know, obviously limiting pedestrian incidents, traffic accidents, and bicycle accidents. What are some of those issues in Central Arkansas? Certainly from a transportation perspective, what are some of the barriers to creating a safe transportation system? Are there any problems in the region that you think maybe we don't have enough of something, or there's not good design, particular things that we don't do well?
One thing
Again, I guess I'm speaking from the smallest community here, but I know in Mayflower, the roads are not conducive to bicycling or pedestrians. The Highway 89 that I live right off of is a 2-lane road with no shoulders. Well, a bicyclist is putting their life in danger riding down Highway 89, and they do it all the time, but there we are. And so the infrastructure is just not there to easily convert to bicycle, vehicle, pedestrian usage. So there's a great deal of expense that's involved in doing that, or getting RDOT to participate in that in some reasonable fashion.
Okay.
One thing I'd piggyback, you know, when we're talking about accommodating for bike and pedestrians, whether it's through trails or on-street facilities, one thing that I've seen that is if a city isn't set up well to where it's got natural drainage ways where bike trails can go, and particularly if those, you know, if they do have them, if they haven't been protected to where you've got a lot of development close up to it that creates barriers to being able to put trails in those locations. If you have to resort to trail and bike lane on a lot of our streets, the concept of access management is so alien in most of our communities that if you do put trails or trails along streets, that you're just creating an unsafe environment, because you've got so many conflicts with people turning in and turning out, or people just aren't accustomed in certain areas to seeing pedestrians or bicyclists. So I think it's one of those areas where the interplay between how we design streets and the policies that we have in terms of regulating the development on the other side of it, or even, you know, like for instance, if we were going to take the Colorado Springs took in certain areas suburban development to its logical extreme, to where they've got walk-in parks, they've got neighborhoods that have areas reserved for greenways, and with walk-in parks, that trails that lead to schools, that all is in a sort of a somewhat suburban environment, but it is totally pedestrian and bicycle accessible, because they plan for it. Our problem is that when we look at subdivision development, we're going to use every single square inch of that, and then whatever's in the floodplain, raise it out of the floodplain and develop on that too, and then not leave any areas for thinking about connectivity of things beyond streets. You know, we're still thinking about how do we get connectivity within our subdivisions, like Walter was saying, it's 600 feet away, that it's, for a lot of communities, the concept of pedestrian connectivity that doesn't involve just the sidewalk on the street is way out there. It's way beyond the pale of what we're looking at. So those are some things that I think we as a region need to address.
Yep, I think you are absolutely right. Before we wrap up, I'll give anybody a chance to comment on anything, any barriers, James's presentation. If anybody has any comments, make them now. I think everybody's spoken. So I appreciate all of y'all being in on this discussion today. We have recorded it, so it will be posted sometime next week. We'll also do that with the next session at 2 p.m. We will have a board meeting for our Metro Plan board. I believe that's on the 26th of this month. Our committee leads will be discussing kind of what we've been working on. Obviously, we're not going to have anything really nailed down yet, even though we do have these themes. We're just going to let them know kind of how our discussions have been going on. And James, I'll get with you and Ryan after these meetings. But that's essentially where we're heading. I'm not sure about next month if we will be meeting or not, but I will let y'all know as soon as I know that. But I'm glad to have y'all here. And again, if y'all need to reach out for any reason or have any comments or anything, please reach out to me. But we appreciate James for giving us a presentation today, and I appreciate all y'all's time. So see y'all later.
Hey, Daniel.
Yeah.
Did I hit everything I needed to hit on?
Yeah.
Okay.
You did really good. So that's definitely next meeting. That's the same. Let's do the same thing.
Okay. Sounds good.
Hey, Daniel,
Yes.
can you email me this livable group themes list you got here? It's not a live screen, so I can't print it.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
I guess I'll probably just send it out to everybody. It was just kind of working notes right now, but yeah, I can send it out.
It'd be good. Thanks a lot.
All right. Have a good one.